Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this keynote with Professor Orit Halpern, the Smartness Mandate. It's going to be very exciting to hear this presentation, and we have the luxury of having a conversation with her afterwards as well. There is also participation online, so people who are watching this online, remember that you can ask questions as well, and the audience, of course, is invited. Orit Halpern is a professor of digital cultures at the Technische Universität in Dresden. And her research is in an interesting crossroads between the human interactions that are involved in our current political economy, drawing from history and technology, art, design, and ideology. I look very much forward to hearing this presentation. Afterwards, we will be sitting right here and enjoy this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and thank you everyone at IMPAKT, all the curators, all of you for sitting here and listening to me on Thursday evening. So I really appreciate the invitation. So today I'm going to talk about, well, first I have to get my slides. The Smartness Mandate. And this is work that is partially based on a book I have coming out in December or early January for people in Europe from MIT Press with Robert Mitchell, titled The Smartness Mandate. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about both smartness, but actually moreover I'm going to talk about environment and economy, and another term that's really part of this mandate to be smart, resilience. So I have to say, I love The Curse of Smooth Operations as a title because mostly I live in a world of people preparing for the worst with the rosiest of attitudes. A curse if operations are smooth. So for SAP, of course, you wouldn't need them if your supply chain wasn't disrupted. And from managing consulting firms to software firms that prepares for disruption, I live in a world where we're kind of pessimistically optimistic, that we kind of expect things to go wrong, actually. And yesterday in the New York Times, there was this feature about this Roku City screensaver where everyone who was interviewed for the article was like, I just want to live in the city. And as you see in this beautiful city, it's being destroyed by robots and dinosaurs in the background. But despite all this disaster, everyone seems to be just fine and going out to dinner and watching movies, or maybe just streaming media. So I wonder about this desire to live there, but I also point to this because, of course, this is an art festival, and we're trying to create aesthetics that confront and perhaps reimagine our future. So what does it mean when we imagine the future as disastrous? And how do we intervene with some of these imaginaries? And I have to say I'm kind of conflicted with this because it's not clear to me if everything's being destroyed, if we're just cohabitating now with volcanoes and robots and dinosaurs. So I'm calling this kind of negative hopefulness, resilient hopefulness. It's the assumption that shocks and crisis and catastrophe are expected, and yet somehow we're still kind of hopeful. And so today I'm going to talk about this form of hope and its relationship to ubiquitous computing infrastructures. So anyone who knows me knows I work a lot on smart cities, like this one in South Korea. That Songdo, which is an ubiquitous or smart city in Korean parlance, built by Cisco and POSCO and other chaebol with the assistance of the Internet Free Economic Zone, a governmental body. And of course, it comes replete with a central park that you see here and lots of nice high-end luxury condos. And it's all supposedly very green, but it was grafted out of the South China Sea. That's not very environmentally nice. And it's at sea level. So there are questions here about sustainability. It's also part of a new landscape geopolitically. So this is also a frontier. It's very close to the North Korean border, and this is sort of part of a broader kind of South Korean ambition around kind of dealing with what it sees as being surrounded by enemies, mainly China and North Korea, and kind of surviving through better engineering, science, and technology. And I'm going to come back to this kind of pessimistically optimistic vision of the future. But here's another city I've worked on. It's Hudson Yards in New York City. It's a $30 billion development co-produced with Sidewalk Labs of Google, SAP, and numerous other corporate partners. It comes replete with an award-winning architectural marvel of a park built by architects like Diller and Scafidio, the High Line, probably lots of you have visited, where you can take your tourist photos. And trust me, that's about all you're going to be taking away from this place, unless maybe academics and artists make a lot more money in Holland than they do in New York. But this place is full of luxury shopping. It's all green. There's like a Kate Spade green design studio and lots of greenness. And it caters to quote-unquote high earners, according to real estate reports. And the medium one-bedroom apartment costs about 1.3 billion, whatever. With inflation, you know how things are going these days. 1.3 million USD for about 40 meters squared. I mean, again, that might be normal here. And the average rent per month, one bedroom, again, is about $5,000 USD a month. So this might not be for everyone. And certainly not in the US. But what it is a super smart development. It's got microgrids for electricity and e-waste systems being built by SAP that's supposedly going to like recycle and turn all the waste into energy. It'll be great. It has a lot of water catchment, actually. A lot of Dutch urban planners and designers do a lot of work for the city of New York in terms of advice for climate change. So it's got all the right catchment areas for when the storm surge happens to divert the water. It also has rainwater capture systems for recycling water. And the whole thing, as you can see, it's already built on on top of this old rail infrastructure. So you see it's already raised, but it's all raised between 50 to 150 meters to survive that storm surge. So don't worry, your Tesla in the garage is going to be okay through the hurricane and probably still charging on that autonomous sovereign microgrid. So this computational wonder will survive even if New York City doesn't. So here's a great piece from Business Insider. $25 billion mega development can withstand a superstorm or terrorist attack. And mind you, there's not much difference. And this is a deeply securitized site as well, and we'll talk about that later, even if the entire city shuts down. We'll come back to that. So coming back to Songdo, South Korea, another luxury suburb of Seoul, the future is also green and smart, but only for some of us. All the marketing from these greenfield developments is about eternal economic growth, fed through smartness and ubiquitous computing. So this happy ubiquitous computing for this harmonious green city. And behind all this fanciness is, of course, the fact that disaster, mainly global warming, so there's kind of a real anticipation of infrastructural failure and, in fact, Earth systems issues for humanity that hides behind all this kind of fancy happiness. But somehow we've come to believe that more bandwidth is going to somehow equal resilience. Our ability to overcome these shocks is going to equal survival. So now how the rate of the rate of data coming through a cable has come to equal survival of the human species, I have no idea. There's no proof, of course, that computing is green, but nonetheless, this seems to have become kind of, I'm sure, naturalized, not in this audience, but you'd be shocked how prevalent this is in engineering and design and certainly in corporate jingo. But what's so interesting is that even while there's like kind of this dark, ominous future kind of mounting in the backdrop, is that no matter what, when I asked engineers at Songdo, and this place is incredibly, as I mentioned, vulnerable ecologically, economically, it's incredibly debt leveraged, so there's a lot of finance in here and a lot of debt and risk that's been taken off. And of course, politically, right, it's in this geopolitically fraught zone. When I asked the people who are building it, both engineers and government officials, what happens if this project fails, either economically or politically? And considering it has 300,000 citizens, this isn't like an inconsequential question. I got this really curious answer. People were like, well, we'll just build another version. It's just a testing ground. This is literally what people call this place. Example, experimental, repeatable, a prototype, a demo. In short, it's just a test. So even if something happens, it's not really, I guess, real. It's like the future just never arrives. It always just gets deferred or maybe disrupted through the introduction of more and more technology. We could say then that we have this new sentiment of we're pessimistically computationally optimistic. Things aren't going so well, things break down all the time, but somehow we'll just keep betting on that direction. And this is sort of perhaps best embodied with a kind of bad tech bro shenanigans of Elon Musk and others in Silicon Valley that are somehow perhaps they can just get out of this situation or somehow get that future not to arrive or just find a planet B. So white, straight tech bros get their escape. Too bad about the rest of us. And I label this mode of managing the future or disrupting, if we will, the future through financial speculation, technology, and big data analytics, the Smartness Mandate. So how do we document this condition and create some new concepts? And maybe we need some new ideas. At a time when our world is often viewed in catastrophic terms, from wars to global warming, and societies increasingly speak in terms of survival and post-planetary escape, it's essential that we imagine ways of living that are not merely about a few surviving in technological, high-tech citadels like Hudson Yards or Singapore or Dubai, but that we worry about how the rest of our planet, its many forms of life, will come to exist. So how do we kind of make this equation, if we will, about pessimistic computational optimism, i.e. smartness, not equal a kind of resilient hopefulness? So how do we kind of challenge the normalization of disaster and breakdowns and the kind of subsequent disaster capitalism? Of course, I'm not the only person who's noted this phenomena. And of course, so many of you in here are already doing this. So that's kind of a backdrop on what sort of drives me to be thinking about smartness and about Smartness Mandate. But in the second half of this talk, I'm going to kind of shift registers and talk briefly about the history of this question of resilience. So this kind of part of the talk is going to be sort of like, now that we've seen all the people who just really where the operability of things is just a nightmare. So if the tech worked, it would be terrible. Because they wouldn't get to build another version. I'm now going to talk briefly, I'm going to switch registers actually to history, since I'm a historian, and talk briefly about history of the idea of resilience, which I think is one of the key operations of what I'm calling the Smartness Mandate, and how we've normalized shock and catastrophe as standard states, normals even of contemporary life, and ask how we've come to view this situation as acceptable. Since I'm not an artist, but am a humanities professor and a historian of science, I insist that by tracing where we've come from, maybe we can reimagine where we want to go. And I don't mean that like go gone. I mean we have to examine the violent histories of race, capital, or maybe I do, capital, coloniality, and sex to begin these new imaginings. So I'm going to posit this term that you've probably heard a lot as to begin an opening. So today, in the midst of the in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, a war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, economic volatility, and the ongoing climate crisis, the term new normal has been circulating ad nauseum throughout news outlets and social networks, and even through media theory. This new normal is largely defined by a naturalization of precarity for some and the dramatic elevation of profits for others. Endless curves and data visualizations show us these facts. I hazard also that the new normal, as a language, demonstrates the extreme embrace of the idea that our systems regularly fail, that in fact we live in a constant state of social, environmental, economic, and political disaster. But it's hard to look at these curves and not be reminded of a history of actuarial practices involving populations. It is also surprising how tenacious the ideology of the new normal is, of normalcy, period, and how reluctant we are to cease using it. The idea of the normal curve, of course, was an invention of 19th century human sciences, underpinning contemporary understandings of economies, populations, and race. So, normalcy, right, as we know from, these are, for example, eugenic charts by Francis Galton, who was one of the progenitors, sort of statistical thinking about demography, the cousin of Darwin, and these were efforts to type different people according to agglomerations of photographs to create kind of, if you will, defining characteristics that would allow people to be grouped in certain groups and largely to be compared to what he considered, of course, normal, which was mostly white, heterosexual European males of upper classes, and to demonstrate deviation. And it's really interesting in these charts, the way that things like disease and criminality are compressed. And here you see kind of Irish criminals. He also has a series of composites of Jews, so there's different groups. And these were also used in the United States a lot around race. So the question here is that these concepts of a normal body and an abnormal body are very much also about ideas of nature. So one of the things in this compression between, right, the biological and the social is the fact that our models of nature and our models of the social often, and I'm saying nature here in commas, are often very closely linked. And our adherence to the language of normal is therefore also about nature. But what form of nature are we talking about today? So my intent is to briefly historically situate this new nature and ask how our image and language and ideas of technically managed futures sustain contemporary forms of structural violence and perhaps sustain some of these older forms of discrimination, race, and sex. So few images are as prevalent recently, at least in the United States, than the kind of flatten the curve image. The current instantiation emerged from a 2007 article on community-based mitigation of pandemic influenzas published by the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. Apparently, no one can remember who exactly made this chart, and there are precedents, of course. In 1918, the flu pandemic, different urban areas were compared to create kind of different mitigation strategies. And during World War II, I don't actually have the curves, but actually the exact same curve was used by operations researchers and the military of the United States to demonstrate how rationing could save materials and energy for the military. So in both cases, there's this effort to kind of adjust the temporality and change the future through these kind of curves. For our purposes, however, flatten the curve as a discourse has some curious features. Among them is the assumption that pandemics are inevitable and that there is uncertainty as to when and where they will start. So we know they will come, but we don't know when. Public health officials have long warned of coming pandemics, and there's a large and popular literature to this effect that doesn't seem to sufficiently impact policy, at least in the US. And such calls have become ever more visible and popular in the few decades since the reemergence of infectious disease in the global north with HIV/AIDS. Virtually no one in public health doubts the possibility of another zoonotically transferred epidemic. The only question is when, not if. And of course, popular culture has long been fully aware that the coming pandemic is coming. like I said, there's no agreement as to the exact moment or location of the outbreak. Pandemics are clouded in uncertainty. They are, to use Donald Rumsfeld's famous words, known unknowns. Furthermore, the discourse assumes that the emergence of new diseases is difficult to entirely mitigate. While public health professionals and many others fully understand that better urban planning, social equity, and public health infrastructures, transforming agricultural systems, improving environmental management, and many other factors might change the inevitability of future pandemics, almost none of us actually believe the necessary structural changes that would save so many lives will happen, or even part of them. As a result, we must manage the uncertain event, ergo flattening the curve. And in that COVID-19 spread through breath and life, we have to slow the metabolism of the system to accelerate the demise of the virus. This is the management of temporalities, a strategy that assumes catastrophe will occur, but that there are ways to treat this trauma, if you will, or mitigate it. And I'll discuss this management here. So this idea of the world, which we kind of take and accept as a given or as a nature, wasn't always so. So in the coming parts, I'm going to talk about ecos, both ecology and economy, and how the two converge in kind of the understanding of the world as resilient. So volatility and uncertainty were not always considered the norms of nature. Since the Second World War, cybernetically informed ecologists had built models that understood the world in terms of homeostatically organized network systems. Initial models grounded in communication sciences and tested on the landscape of nuclear blasts valorized stability. So American imperialism imagined these islands, the Pacific Proving Grounds, as a kind of testing ground, the first, I guess, planetary test, and a lot of my work is interested in levels of planetary scale experimentation or testing, but perhaps like an extreme negative side of the Cisco imagined Songdo. But these testing grounds for new technologies and for imagining the radioactive future. As well as the ecology. So these are, you see, research groups working with the ODMs that went around collecting specimens. And as you see from the radioautograph of this fish, the radioisotopes gave new ways to visualize the environment. So the radioisotopes birthed contemporary ecological practices, allowing scientists to trace food chains and species relations through the accumulation of isotopes in animal bodies, thus allowing them to visual, ecological, in fact, environmental scales of metabolism and relatedness. So you could see the relations between the animals through the traces of these isotopes. Ironically, birthing our contemporary understandings of ecosystems, while also this focus on sort of what's happening to the animals and to the ecology, evaded the historical feature of indigenous dispossession, since there are also people on these islands, many of whom were dispossessed for these, and also others that had to suffer the ravages of radiation on their bodies and on their food systems and on their lifestyles. So this historical feature of indigenous dispossession was kind of moved out, and the mass ecological devastation, of course, as well. So these islands and, this idea of a test bed at the size of populations, or these kind of islands, or island cities, is, of course, a long-running imaginary in the European history. So the island is a place for European imaginaries and experiments in social form, and terraforming has been perhaps in existence since the colonization of the New World. And these are also the first landscapes of technical destruction and futurity. So even our ideas of utopia, of course, are grounded in these notions of the island isolate as a place for the testing of the future of life. But as a result of also the nuclear context, the idea of imbalance in nature, just like imbalance between the superpowers, was to be avoided, and systems should be managed for stability. The most extensive effort at computing the future of the planet and populations, the Limits to Growth report of 1972, modeled, to cite Paul Edwards, such a closed world. And here you can see these kind of cybernetically closed loops that were kind of informed by this radioisotope research. And it's really interesting that this nuclear vision also, in many ways, allowed a new datafication of the environment, right? So it increasingly allowed the computability and the modeling of ecosystems at scale. Limits to Growth, of course, was a clarion call to an emergent environmental movement. And this computerized report saw a world in need of balance, one where change was an anomaly, not a norm. The computer scientists modeled human behavior in populations as aberrations, producing terminal traumas to the environment that would lead to catastrophe. The answer was to restore the balance of the planet through the careful management of feedback loops and return it to a sustainable state, which meant to say just maintain the current state without change. But just as soon as Limits to Growth came out, there was a bunch of folks who just didn't like that vision of the world. So a new language started to emerge around resilience. Many ecologists, environmentalists, and economists did not agree with the report XO. Ecosystems, they argued, do not appear to stabilize after suffering disruption. There could be no going back to historically less damaged planet. DDT, Agent Orange, nuclear disasters, all of these things demonstrate to produce long-ranging impacts on humans and ecosystems, and just ceasing the use of a toxin or attempting to reseed an environment just didn't return systems to their past. So you just couldn't seemingly go back to where you were before you contaminated an environment or disrupted it. But economists were actually the most prominent to lead the attack. Friedrich August von Hayek, for example, in his Nobel Prize speech in 1974 opens, and it's not on this quote, with an attack on limits to growth, pleading to the global community to refute such certainties and imaginaries of control over the future. Hayek and many other economists and engineers question the assumption that the world could just evolve without change. Do not, they ask, humans learn? And what about technology anyway? Hayek stated, man must guard against becoming, and it was man for him, accomplice in men's fatal striving to control society. And this is a society for which there is a civilization which no brain has decided. So there's no centralized planning authority in his vision of the world, but has grown from the free efforts of millions of individuals. Hayek posited a world full of uncertainty and chance, one we cannot control. Unable to predict the future, we should relinquish planning, so no state planning, for instead managing. Assuming that societies, like ecologies, emerge from decentralized networks of coordinated information through markets, and refute the possibility of regulation on the market. Systems should self-organize from the free efforts of millions, not the conscious decision-making of the few, and control, understood as the prediction of future events perfectly, is impossible. It's also really important that in this neoliberal discourse comes the emergence of this new idea of the social network, of the market, as kind of comprised of kind of a networked intelligence. So the valorization of intelligence, not as centralized in either a state or in the brain, but rather, or in the subject, in terms of the liberal subject, but rather a kind of distributed self-organizing system that emerges through connectivity, is already coming out through neoliberal discourse, actually starting even earlier in the 40s, but really coming forward in the 70s with prominence. And these new ideas of nature and economy, so we can say the ecos, both ecology and economy, came within a context where older models of political economy were also in flux. The end of Bretton Woods, decolonization, post-Fordism, the OPEC oil crisis, to name a few of the transformations at the time, induced extreme volatility in politics, currency, and commodity markets. In 1973, almost exactly at the same time, all these things are happening, 72, 73, 74, Milton Friedman announced a major need for a broad, wide-based, active, and resilient futures market. Published in an important article, The End of Bretton Woods, An Opportunity Yet again, the collapse of the world's monetary system provides this opportunity for a vibrant futures market and currencies. Friedman laid out his vision of the future for the world's currency markets. He argued that the end of the gold standard provided a previously unforetold opportunity. The new volatility, which is that all these currencies are floating, would not mean instability, he argued, but rather opportunity. And that opportunity was indeed fulfilled by the rise of a new technology, mainly derivative pricing equations that you're seeing behind me. So these ideas and these kind of equations actually drove the computerization of the financial market. And inside equations like this one that allow you to hedge futures, to combine different assets, and to dispute the risk and time of the bet. So you don't have to find out what happens. It's just like in the 2008. You can put together some bad mortgages, some good mortgages, sell them off to someone else before you find out what happens to the homeowner, or if they can resell those mortgages. Sometimes it doesn't work so well, but anyway, the idea is you get to buy the future, but never have to get there. You can short it. It's just like Songdo, where we can also sort of just version in if it doesn't quite work out, right? And there's also a lot of nature in these equations. So they're basically random walks from physics and thermodynamics combined with normal curves, allowing you to time bets on things you can't fully predict. So this is the kind of way you go into the dark, kind of make up prices, and more importantly, you're betting on the relationship between things. You're not looking at one asset, you're looking at that asset in relationship to something else. So it's a way to manage times and metabolisms, just like our resilience curves. And in fact, these equations today make up the largest markets on Earth. According to some people, if the entire world GDP, so that's everything we actually make materially, is 50 trillion, the global financial derivative market is $700 trillion. So it's one of the most powerful forces on this planet. And especially if we want to talk about environment and energy, all of which is highly derived, as we're currently finding out through all the manipulations of the market and oil prices. But what about nature? So we've gone through economy. What would a resilient ecology look like? At the same moment, of course, in 1973, as Milton Friedman is proposing his options and derivatives, a year after Limits to Growth, the ecologist C.S. Halling, a Canadian ecologist working with the Forest Service, looking at Canadian management of natural resources, introduced a new idea. Individuals die, populations disappear, and species become extinct. That is one view of the world. But there's another view, one that concentrates not so much on presence and absence as upon the numbers of organisms and the degree of constancy of numbers. So this is the key point. Essentially, another attack on limits, Halling posited an alternative world. Not a world without change heading towards catastrophe, but a world where change, even catastrophic, is the norm and heralds not the end of systems, but evolution. Extinctions happen, but systems, degrees, and evolution occur. So this, for example, is a series of population prediction charts. Depending on different things that will happen, you have different futures. So Halling developed this concept of resilience to contest the premise that ecosystems were healthy when they returned back to an equilibrium state after being disturbed. And this is kind of his heuristic, this kind of panarchy image that came out a bit later, where it's kind of a series of processes, and you can kind of see there's a rip there and a plus, and then the system might change state. So it might maintain some of its basic forms and functions, but ultimately it would kind of transform. And his argument was that overemphasis on predator-prey relationships often ignored more complex interactions and overvalued equilibrium. Nitrogen, carbon, and other cycles, interactions of mutual aid, collaboration, or competition between many species was not structured as predator-prey relations. And there's so many other impacts, of course, on ecosystems. Extinction might be not the limit to the growth or change of a system unless it fundamentally transformed a complex web of interaction. So his main invention was to basically think we can't understand ecosystems in terms of just the number of animals, or if something goes extinct, we always have to think of the degree of constancy, that is the relationships between the animals or the species in a system. So it's about keeping relationships going. If sustainability was the language of stable systems in a cyclical economy, resilience is the language of volatility. And this emerged out of his early critiques on management of resources. So in an early critique of industrial fishery and forest management, he argued that the focus on using just reseeding fish or attempting to close the bank wasn't really enough. So basically, in Canada, the cod collapsed and they closed the fishing banks, but somehow the cod just never came back. And one of the arguments was that it wasn't just about the cods, it's about all the other little fishies and things that live around the cods, and we can't just look at one thing. And the same thing was true of trees. So he looked at forests and budworms, and he argued that managing ecosystems with a focus on stability was an error, that just kind of using insecticides wasn't going to help the spruce trees grow. So basically, these bugs were killing these spruce trees that the forest industry really liked. Managers, he suggested, in order to keep these forests, must cease counting and taxonomically placing populations in boxes and flowcharts, and needed to realize that positive feedback is dynamic and produces change. So there needs to be a constant kind of instability and thinking about the forest. So in this case, the boreal forest, the absolute number of spruces is not important. What's important is the ability of the forest to rejuvenate and continue growing trees. And what you're looking at is also a new way to measure things and look at the world. These are topographical maps that show the variation of relationships between the population of insects and different types of trees. So the important thing is that there's fluctuating numbers of populations, and there has to be a constant variation in the forest, if you're managing it, between spruce, fir, birch, and budworms. So there's a number of trees that kind of change their ascendance in the Canadian forest, and you need to be thinking about. The system regularly changes. Today, we use the term ecosystem services to kind of define this. Resilience, by contrast, denoted for hauling the capacity of a system itself to change in periods of intense external perturbation as a mode of persistence. So as a result of sort of thinking about this form of rethinking ecology, I want to just summarize what Halling and many of his colleagues came up with. First, stability does not equal resilience. So just having a homeostatic system doesn't mean you have a resilient system. So volatility and uncertainty are the norm. Two, it's a new way to model and measure the world. As I mentioned, systems have to be defined in terms of processes and relations, just like you looked at the trees. Or for example, in charts like this, where we have ecosystem services around cities being reflected, what you're seeing in these maps is not the number of species or which one. You're seeing, like, for example, if people need to eat, if there's fishing, wood harvesting, maybe some of these environments also sustain other animals. Whatever the services are, you're seeing these bundles of services being mapped out around the world, around these urban areas, and showing how those services are necessary for the sustenance of the city. So it's a rethinking also of nature and culture, or rurality and urbanity. Finally, a correlate to this approach is that finally, there's a really interesting feature, and this is where ecology and economy separate, which is that efficiency doesn't necessarily equal evolution, that diversity is necessary for adaptation, and that resilience doesn't equal optimization. So one of the key things that ecologists emphasized was that heterogeneity and diversity is important to facilitating resilience. So if an ecosystem isn't diverse enough, it can't change, it can't adapt when something happens. And the same thing is true of your logistics system. If you have too few providers, if all your pieces for the car came from Japan and suddenly there was a tsunami in Fukushima, you've got a problem. So just-in-time production often runs into problems with resilience. But the same was considered true in ecology. So there's a really interesting kind of third element. Resilience thus possesses some curious features. On one hand, the focus on processes, or what are today are labeled ecosystem services, means that some lives and populations, for example, the racial disparity in COVID situations and the people who could be sacrificed as necessary workers while others were spared, that some lives and populations are acceptably sacrificed as long as the system continues to operate. And trauma is regularized and normalized as an event. On the other hand, environmental managers recognize that the only systems with robust diversity, redundancy, and supplemental capacities might survive catastrophic events. Resilience fluctuates, therefore, between the two poles of Darwinian evolutionary theory, survival of the fittest and necessity for variety and diversity. So perfect optimization might come with a cost of adaptation. Managing for resilience also vacillates between other debates involved in evolution, mainly nature versus nurture, except this has been reformulated now as code and context. So do you focus on a single genome? What's the scale we actually think about when we're talking about resilience? A city, a body, an entire infrastructure, or the planet? This term understands both understandings to advance. In fact, increasingly, resilience no longer just means optimizing or improving, but actually making systems better, maybe even super ecology. So there's now like a super resilience. Resilience then begins to take a new formation, not just keeping systems stable or optimizing existing variables, but actually producing new frontiers for growth or extraction. And in the extraction industry, that's very common. So more technology, more smartness, more computer, and better management of both forests, but also other things like, for example, supply chains, how disruption yields opportunities to increase the growth of your thing, or Deutsche Bank, how investment is going to deal with climate change. All these things are actually demonstrating that we're actually moving into a not just defensive position, but actually a super productive, or like resilience is about bettering the system. And this is particularly true in the extraction industries I've worked, where supposedly Industry 4.0 is facilitating actually ever greater levels of extraction, supposedly with less environmental impact. So this brings us to our present and our curves. By the early 2000s, following 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis and climate change, resilience has taken a central place in fields ranging from business management and logistics to psychology. As you can see, the essence of resilient psychology, and adaptive management, business continuity management, and climate resiliency planning, and many other related terms are all the direct outgrowths from ecological resilience and largely shape our understandings of how changing climatic and security conditions are to be dealt with. A search for online resilience in the time of COVID-19 reveals a massive number, as I mentioned, of articles, websites, and consulting services dedicated to logistics, psychology, and community activism. From managers of supply chains and corporations such as SAP and IBM, resilience is what corporations must do to ensure business continuity. Just-in-time manufacturing is now just-in-case, and corporations are urged to increase their options, to diversify supply chains geographically, and to begin thinking about plasticity of manufacturing infrastructure, being able to make alternative products. And actually, I was just talking to Stephen about Amazon's kind of plasticity and capacity to constantly shift locations to avoid labor issues. And to identify vital, and this is kind of an encouraged mode, that there's sort of an increase. And of course, as this is happening, for example, for many on the right, of course, discourses such as this is a call to expend populations they do not value. So during COVID, of course, in the call of survival, the elderly, people with underlying health conditions, people of color were all considered sacrificable in the name of saving the economy, right? Resilience thus becomes a mode of naturalizing violence for the right. However, resilience might also have positive connotations or faint messianic capacities, to invoke Benjamin. Recent events have highlighted other comprehensions of resilience. For many people on Earth, trauma has long been the norm, but the future should not be the same. On the Black Lives Matter website, resilience is imagined as an alternative possibility. We affirm our humanity, our contributions to the society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. That's the Black Lives Matter website. The race theorist Kara Keeling has recently argued for resilience, or citing Nassim Taleb, she uses the term anti-fragility as a figure of thought for Black liberation, the possibility of getting stronger through ongoing shock. This is not an unproblematic thought. But I think the tactic of actually using neoliberal operations and concepts as a tool for Black liberation is interesting and worth thinking and acting with. I take her to mean a new idea of shock, not a concept of shock that legitimates the sacrifice of lives, but one that recognizes for Black humans and many others, trauma has been ongoing, has been continuous, and can be survived. At the center is an argument that shock may make one stronger, but resilience always admits our ecological relations to others. It's always a relational system, right? We're no longer looking at individuals, but their relations. The necessity for diversity and the possibility that the future of a system will never be its past. Resilience, we might recall from Ecology, demands change and diversity. It's also a way to turn away from imagining worlds only in relation to failures of infrastructure, technology, and businesses. But refusing the term fragility is also a turn against security, and the idea, to quote Foucault, that society must be defended, that we're fragile, that things might break, is a fear, because it's constantly a risk of failure. Likewise, we can no longer only think about survival and defending the species, usually against other species or humans of different colors, sexes, faiths, etc., but instead asking how we want to live, in what relations. We're not fragile entities threatened with extinction, we're actually just struggling over which futures and for whom. What might we gain if we abandoned fragility and, by extension, survival? This has lately come up a lot as reproductive rights are eroding, most notably in the USA, but also globally, along with a new neo-Malthusianism and racist discourse of not enough children, while at the same time immigration is banned and ageism is prevalent. So there's kind of a new kind of discourse, especially in Europe, on this question. Here we must contend with how we understand evolution and genealogy. Financial and logistical comprehensions of resilience largely assume a world of scenario plans and unanticipatable futures divorced from historical legacy or context. Focusing on services eliminates the need to focus on environments or milieus, the conditions of possibility for life. But resilience could also operate differently. In the spirit of Black Lives Matter or feminism, could we not understand resilience as about historical consciousness and actual redesigning of institutions and environments? The future does not need to replicate the past. Resilience can be a call for multiplicity and for futures not yet known. It could yet offer a model of ecological thinking that might defeat the optimizing demands of capital or conservatism. It might offer the possibility of not a new normal, but a new nature. And I kind of end with a cyborg image of Afro-futurist Fengechi Mutu. Think about that.
Wow, thank you, Orit. That was a really rich presentation. There's a lot to parse there. I just wanted to remind everybody that you are invited to take part in this conversation, of course. But I'm trying to find in your presentation or in your research and in your thinking if you come back to resilience, but also to the word opportunity, which is like seemingly like the idea to fall back on from a class, in a class perspective, from the ruling class, I would say, you know, in terms of staying afloat no matter what, or actually staying staying afloat at first, but then doing better because of crisis. And when you brought this up with the Black Lives Matter, of course, there's a problematic in this idea that, like, you know, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. But this is really something that has been used over and over again in order to would you say that it's used ideologically to get people to sort of incorporate or reify this idea that actually does work for the capitalist class? Like, they actually do get richer through different capitalist crises, right? Mm-hmm. And always have. But do you think that there is, like, that the problem is so deep with this, like, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, this type of internalized resilience, that it actually could be like an ideological trap?
That's an excellent question, and I have to say, I've been kind of looking for a way out of my own genealogy and mapping, and I'm not really clear I've gotten one. So I kind of deployed Kara Keeling's work. She's because I thought it was interesting and kind of interesting to think with. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's true that there's a really problematic element, and particularly she's citing neoliberal thinkers to make this argument. But I think that there's also a contextualization question. Like, the idea of, you know, that which will not kill you makes you stronger is very different than saying it hasn't killed us, we're still here, and we don't want the future to keep doing the same thing it's done in the past. And I think right. that's one of the, and that's one of the issues, is that so many of these tactics are about evacuating time. It's just like this, like scientists evacuate the context within which they collect their data, or finance capital is the most intense about evacuating the history of the asset. You know, by the time you've derived 700 trillion from a $50 trillion GDP, these financial technologies are so, they're asset over asset compared to hedged, packaged in a way that, like, it's very difficult, right, to disentangle the actual relations that are producing the underlying materials, or what it's actually doing. There seems to be, you know, finance capital, even more than computing, seems to be in the realm of the abstract and the untraceable. And we see that now that there's all this ESG, these new, you know, ethical investing tools and instruments. You know, how does that work really? And in many ways, it's a conversation that has to come into our computing discussions, because we always talk about the materialities, but we never talk about the money. Like, there's like capital in theory, but not finance. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think there's a real difference about how these discourses are attached, again, to history, what they're connected to. But I also have to say that don't think you can get out of capital, and I don't know if I'm now increasingly interested in economy, like which economies, how do we produce value?
Wait, you said that you don't think that we can get out of capital?
Yeah, you know, one of my concerns is that fantasy just kind of replays that same fantasy of, like, there's a nature outside, that there's some nature that's not touched by human beings. It's like there's some real thing, and then there's like the fake Anthropocene or whatever. And ultimately, like, I don't know if there's any outside to nature culture, but I think we can talk about we can talk about economies. There are different economies with different ways of producing value and different relations between materials, labor, money, you know, everything. Technology.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, the idea that, of course, there is no outside, there's no, like, we're not looking at this whole thing that's happening from some other position. But yeah, then of course, when you talk about, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to hog the conversation here. I want people to be involved as soon as possible. There's a microphone that can be passed around, but I'm just wondering about is that the same type of statement as like the conflation of the political economy with nature, that it is a natural sort of state?
I mean, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I guess both are problematic. Assuming that either is nature, or somehow assuming either, I guess the real question is, let's maybe shift our language and talk about biological determinism or determinism. Or techno-determinism. And maybe the real question here is how are we, as we've spent so long degrading these categories and conflating them, like particularly like nature and society or nature and culture, I think now it's a question of how do we create ideas of or defeat ideas of determinism, like that the world had to end up this way, and that our future will have to look like this. So I started the talk with a series of examples of, kind of a world that's always understood as going to be in a catastrophic state. That's kind of an accepted thing, and even now an aestheticized and valorized thing. And so I think our questions are sort of more about inevitability, determinism, and coming back to old ideas like agency, like where does that sit and for whom?
Right. And how do you see that then, with this agency in terms of, well, I mean, if there's an acceptance, I was going to say, of, that's a funny slip play. Well, if there's an acceptance of this exceptional, the new normal, well, what type of agency is, like, how is that countered in a way? I mean, if the end of the world narrative becomes such an attractive narrative, you showed this
Roku city.
Yeah, the Roku city. I mean, I'm sure everybody kind of feels that these days, that it's not like the end of the world is like a fear anymore as much as it is like a sort of attachment, but it's an attachment to something that you still push off into the future. It has to be connected to this major event, so that you sort of obscure or don't pay attention to that it's actually happening, because you're not really seeing the real event. But then, like, if that's what all of us are watching, if we're all part of this attachment, then where would you say that the agency lies, or what does the agency look like then, rather, maybe, if you prefer?
I mean, there's obviously tons of people experimenting with many different forms of action. So I'm not going to go into like and I don't have answers. Like, I'm not going to provide one. I would say that within my own thinking, it comes back a lot to thinking about diversity and temporalities. So that I think it's really important. The first thing that's really important is to maintain like a lot of different systems and institutions alive. So I feel, for example, it's pretty important not to abnegate civil rights. So like the last minute of the talk is just me going off onto my own concerns about the erosion of civil rights right now in the United States, both for African American, for everyone who's not of certain categories, but really the rollback of the civil rights, the possibility of civil rights. I don't even know if they were realized. That was started with the civil rights movement in the 50s and the early 60s in the U.S. This is still a question of institutions that will maintain basic infrastructures, just basic capacity to do things like vote, that are essential to exercise political power. I don't think we can just abandon the question, even though I'm not a fan of the nation state, and maybe we need new forms of governance. But there's always a question, ultimately, of politics, which isn't just exerting power and force, but actually how do you make yourself seen and heard how do you actually gain power? And so for me, I think that part of it is not abandoning actually all those projects immediately in the name of other forms, but also that can be recombined with new forms of collectivity, some of which even smack neoliberally, like all the a lot of things neoliberals say can sound like a lot of indigenous sovereignty groups or other things. So we're trying to think of new combinations, right? Where people are thinking about both collectively and creating localized spaces while still enacting ways to shift and change institutions. So ultimately, I think the real question is there's no one right way, and that's the kind of dangerous tendency, is to be like, we have to give up. We can't think about civil rights anymore. We now just all have to organize locally and create a collective here in this thing, or it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right. I understand.
I don't know if that's clear.
Feel free, please, to interfere. Can you help? Okay.
I have a question. No, I was just wondering then, like, to get out of determinism, but if one then would adopt this idea of the shock doctrine, or isn't that precisely based on determinism? So how much shock do you need in order for people to suddenly make a revolution or something like that? It's it seems like there is no end to the amount of shock people can live under without doing anything, because we see lately how things have really gone crazy, and yet the system is still there. So I wonder, just, is it really possible to think in terms of, if you want to, I agree very much with this idea of getting out of determinism, but it seems completely incompatible with the idea of the shock. You know what I'm saying?
So one thing. So a lot of the book, at least, or the Smartness Mandate, was kind of seen as a follow-up to Naomi Klein's argument about the shock doctrine, where you create the shock and then neoliberalism comes in. But we argued, now it's not even a clear-cut event. It's become a standardized state for maintaining that system. But I have to say, I don't think shock is the route to anything, really, so much anymore, because I think it has been normalized. So I really question where discourses of crisis and catastrophe are taking us, actually, in terms of political imaginaries or capacities to act. And I think that's the big thing. I have a project, I didn't really talk about it, but I have a project with artists, designers, other people. We could all join. But it's called Against Catastrophe, and it's fundamentally about, we have to be thinking in modes that don't constantly reinscript and even question this kind of narrative of constant shock or crisis. And I think that's why it resonated. I created this talk for you because it so resonated in me, the title of this festival, that how shocking would it be if things weren't all breaking down every minute and terrible? What if some things work? And in fact, you're right. A lot of things work day to day, right? We live lives and they work, more or less. I'm alive. I did a lot of things today. I met lots of people, stuff was working, right? And so it's not about being I guess it is about pessimistic optimism. I don't want to be non-critical, but I also don't want to sink into this discourse of crisis, catastrophe, and shock. And I think there's a way that we need to break that, and that's an important aesthetic. I didn't talk enough about aesthetics here. I was going to, but I think that's a really critical component. In other talks, I really look at the way we kind of, the way we show the end of the world, and the way we imagine or inhabit it, and in many ways, what we have to contend with that, right, as artists, designers, whoever's in this, fiction writers, you know. So,
thank you very much for tonight. And like, there's been a couple of keywords like the deadification of the environment and resilience. I felt it came quite often, and I couldn't stop thinking about the work of Madeline Jins and Ayahuasca, who built a building, but also write a very interesting book called Dying Architecture, where they explain that actually the architecture, like footpaths and stuff like this, are made to lose our senses, and that we're getting like, yeah, somehow actually more and more resilient to our environment compared to where we are in the nature. We always have to pay attention where we're walking or danger that is coming. So my following question is that, is it possible, first of all, to revert actually this system by architecture somehow? If like this brings to the losing sense, then can we bring back sense? And then, I don't know, that's something pop up.
No, that's a powerful idea, and it's one that, again, I've been thinking with designers. I definitely think there's tons of work that's done in placemaking and in resensitizing people to their environments. I know so many people who do, you know, whether it's sound work or, you know, that are about experiencing things through different senses in ways that's kind of sensitize or make us rethink or be in the space differently. Certainly coming from Canada, you know, there's right now at the Center for Canadian Architecture, there's a whole exhibition on Nunavut Indigenous groups, and I don't want to like just valorize Indigenous groups. I think they're amongst many who have very nice placemaking, but I think, of course, many of us have places. But it's a very interesting show about kind of trying to create paths, but also reintroducing kind of histories, especially oral histories, like especially when people have migrated into urban environments, like how do you recreate sentiment or attachment or time? And I think also there's a time question, and we talk about narrative and meaning making a lot. Like actually I'm hearing it coming back. Actually, when I was a grad student, nobody talked about narrative. It was like we were all post-representational and nobody cared about that. But I think we have like a lot of pressure on meaning making actually, and on reorganizing time and sense together in ways that make us relate to each other, to other animals. Apparently, unfortunately in preparation for this, I missed the animal movies, but I'm sure that like part of that was about recreating your relations, right, with other beings. So I think there's also a lot of possibilities, right, in a sort of ecological and in the datafication of the environment. I do want to say that there's some really positive stuff that came out of everything I talked about, like, or positive, or shall we say, hijackable stuff, you know? I don't know. But
that would be interesting to follow on, but we have a question. No, please. Yeah.
If there's still time. Yeah, thank you so much. And I would like, I mean, during the talk and the discussion, I couldn't help thinking about that, like almost every other day, there is like an article proclaiming the end of neoliberalism, the end of globalization, and it's all, of course, connected to the COVID or the supply chain crisis, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, and so on. So I think we are living also in times which are really like, you know, stopping to believe in the idea of a working system and starting to kind of face also a reality of hard geopolitics that have made like a very brutal return. And so I'm wondering, you know, if we can frame everything still within the systems theory framework and talk about, instead of talking about resistance, talk about resilience, and, you know, if there is a shift we are undergoing, or are these claims just, you know, superficial, and it's the systems still that rule underneath. And just to connect that also to the image of Afrofuturism in the end, and the hopefulness in other aesthetics. So Afrofuturism is sort of an artistic practice and that is rooted in not only thinking other futures, but in a transformative idea of temporality, where you're also working with the plasticity of the past in order to build other futures in the here and now. So I'm like wondering about this, the return also other cosmologies or indigenous belief systems, which sort of displace completely, I think, the kind of cybernetic feedback mechanisms that we have used very much to think about or work with temporality. This is a difficult question in the end. But
No, it's great. One of my historians, so unfortunately, I have a hard time commenting when you're in the present. I certainly would like it. Well, let's put it like this. We live in interesting times, and I think there are transformations happening at every moment. In fact, I'm wondering, even like every time you finish a book, you're like, I think it's over, or, maybe I'm wrong. However, I do think the 70s, like, these guys are not cybernetics anymore. Like, limits to growth with cybernetics, these guys are against that mode, but they still have a certain systems theory, and they're about this volatility thing. So there's technologies that don't go away, like the derivatives market's not going away with all the end of globalization. But, and who knows, but there are, I think there's huge structural transformations happening right now. Not necessarily for good, but hopefully. And then there's always this question of history and how the past can reinterrupt the present or be reimagined. A lot of this is about reimagining history anyway, so that we rethink our present, but certainly in league with your comment on Afrofuturism or other things. That's why I stand on the question of difference and always the idea of assemblage. Like, history isn't linear. So things can come back, they can interrupt, they can change. And so in a hopeful way, we're hoping things are changing. And when I get really bleak, I think that we may have just seen an even larger wealth transfer through COVID. And right now with this war, where like whatever's left of your pension fund has been sold off to somebody, and everything's now being reprivatized into the oligarchs' hands, and is making corporations look nice because they were at least publicly traded, and now forget it. It's all like, now it's private equity.
But is there a risk that we think that we can design our way out of this kind of problem?
That too.
Yeah.
But there's so many risks.
Right.
But it's a great question, and I have to say I do think things are changing. Like, I don't think things stay the same, but I think we can ask how these historical influences are kind of. It's always an assemblage. How are they recombining with this current situation? Because as much as globalization is over, I don't hear resilience going away. It's like, it is the term in planning, policy, psychology, like.
Yeah. It suits the zeitgeist in a way, I suppose, to keep pumping it. I saw you had a slide there from the Resilience Center in Stockholm. Mm-hmm. There's like a really kind of proud, like inheritor of
hauling, yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah. That's
a big global policy influence.
But it looks like real nice stuff. It looks very peaceful and friendly, but it has
some of it is. Like I said, resilience has its bright sides.
Right, yeah. But it has a history as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Orit. This was really fascinating. I think that if the program, I don't know right now where everybody is going, but I'm hoping that there's some congregation in the bar and we can keep this conversation up as well. Right? Well, thank you very much, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Great questions.